Hello everyone, today I'm bringing you the first in a series of videos looking at Vietnam War era ephemera from my collection, which is to say personal items. So in this video we're having a look at print media, so magazines and paperbacks, and these can really add a nice flavour to a display at a reenacting event. Obviously some of the titles, some of the publications are more obvious than others, so I wanted to in this video have a look at variety, just to show you the sort of publications which were around at the time, which would have been seen in country. And that's what we're going to have a look at in some detail now. So we're going to talk about magazines first, and these all date from 1967. They're certainly an interesting thing to have as an addition in terms of small kit personal items. Your Vietnam kit when reenacting, they really add something to a display, and in certain instances the stories in them are actually covering the war, and that can be very interesting as well in talking to people and just to set off the display somewhat. Starting on the left here, of course, we do have Playboy. This was an extremely popular magazine at the time, particularly amongst the age group of the men serving in Vietnam. The average age was 19, and Playboy was definitely marketed at that sort of age group. So I guess depending on exactly what you're hoping to represent with your display, Playboy is an obvious choice and very familiar to everyone, I'm sure. I'm not going to get into Playboy in much detail here. Everyone knows about Playboy, everyone knows it was a popular magazine at the time, so it would have been wrong not to include it, but I'm not going to talk about it in any detail here because the idea is to talk about some of the titles which you may have been less familiar with. Again, Time is another magazine which is very well known, and I'm not going to get into a huge amount of detail on that, but I wanted to include them as examples of things you can pick up readily that add something to a display. So moving on to talk about the next magazine along in a little bit more detail, we have here Saga, and I've seen photographs in the PX in Vietnam. Saga was on sale, so would have been something that was available and probably purchased by men serving in Vietnam. Magazines of this nature tended to run with very sensationalised stories. You can see here Flying Saucer story, Motorcycle Rat Pack, scandal behind our second-rate Air Force, which is, if I remember correctly, slagging off McNamara. So quite interesting. Bobby Kennedy's personal war. You have various stories in here, and as I say, told from a very sensational point of view. Interesting period adverts and so forth as well. These are marketed, they're supposed to be easy reading, I guess you could say. They're headline grabbing clickbait of their day, I guess you could say. And the level of journalism is not the highest, but you've got these wonderful sort of colour photographic sections as well in these, and they're really nice thing to collect. I have a few copies of Saga. Obviously the UFO craze at the time was quite prevalent in the 1960s, so you often find that being dealt with in these sorts of publications at the time as well. Some nice cartoons in these as well. So Saga is another very valid choice if you wanted to collect something other than the more typical titles which people probably think of when they think of the Vietnam War. Saga was definitely in circulation in country and would have been quite popular, I imagine, due to the sort of stories that it ran. So Saga is another good example. In a similar vein is Argosy, I think that's how you pronounce it. But you've got, again, you can see from the headlines on the front page here, quite sensational journalism. But you've got an interesting article, Your Next Boat, Combat Proven in Vietnam, and obviously a PBR on the front here. Now I try and pick up copies that don't have these delivery tags on them. Obviously these are tags for people who've ordered these and had them on subscription. There's nothing to say perhaps someone at home hasn't sent you out a copy when they're finished with it. And these all do date from 1967 but different months. So I do try and pick up a few that are a similar sort of period. You can have a few on display and they'll be within a few months of each other. It makes a little bit more sense. These are all the same year, but they do vary. This one was July, and this one's February 1967. But you've got these sensational stories again in here. But again, this is lovely. There's a lot of colour sections in it. Again, advertisements of the time. See if we can find that. Is that the article on the PBR? Let's see if we can find that in here. Here we go, clean sweep for the river jets. So this is the article talking about the PBRs. So again, these magazines can have articles in them which are specific to the war as well, which is quite interesting. Oh, well, only a 2-page article, but nevertheless quite interesting. Oh, continued on page 80. We won't bother with that, but just to show you the spread there, the 2 PBRs, Patrol in Vietnam. So Argosy, another interesting title. These are a little bit harder to find than Saga. They're a little bit more valued, it seems. They're a bigger, thicker publication as well, so there's more in them. But again, interesting sort of cultural history of the time as well, and I quite like them from that point of view. So Saga and Argosy are two options there in terms of more sensational journalism and quite interesting. Time magazine, of course, a very popular publication of the time, perhaps not with the younger generation serving in Vietnam, but if you were perhaps portraying an officer or a lifer, perhaps maybe Time would be something that would be more likely to be seen. But again, sent from a relative at home perhaps, and again this does have a delivery tag on it, as you can see there. Let's see who had this. This is Otto Bisti. I can't pronounce that last name, I'm afraid, but Time magazine again, Vietnam's Thieu, so President Thieu there. Quite interesting from that point of view. Have, again, articles dealing with the war in these, so quite interesting to have on a display as a talking point as well. This is a rather nice copy with this cover, obviously with the Vietnam flag in the background, the Republic of Vietnam flag in the background. Rather eye-catching and nice to have. So Time is definitely an option depending on what you're looking to recreate. And then specialist interest magazines are something you could have as well. Hot rodding magazines are an example of that. So car enthusiasts, you may well have a specialist interest magazine of that sort of nature. You have popular mechanics and so forth at the time as well. All sorts of magazines dealing with specialist topics, photography, that sort of thing. My magazine I have in that sort of vein is a wrestling magazine. Quite interesting in wrestling. I like the 80s scene to a degree in the early 90s. I've been looking back at various matches and shows from that period. So I thought, why not pick up a wrestling magazine from the 60s to add to my small kit? Because let's say the soldier I'm trying to recreate the kit of was into wrestling, and this was sent over from home. The Ring Wrestling from October 1967. And it's a rather good magazine, this. Lots of interesting photographs of wrestling of the time, a very different look from what you had in the 80s and 90s. So obviously you're taking it back to sort of the older days of wrestling here. But nice thing to have, and again, you could have any kind of sort of specialist interest magazine potentially as well. So that's just one example of a specialist interest magazine you might consider having in your kit as well. And having a couple of these on you would not be out of the question. Having a whole stack is probably over-egging the pudding a bit, but having a couple of them certainly adds something to a display, in my opinion. So various options to go at there, obviously. And Playboy being the most obvious and probably one of the most common magazines in circulation in Vietnam, but these are also valid options and a little bit more family friendly potentially if you wanted to put on a display. So various different options there that I wanted to talk about, and obviously going into some of them in more detail than others, but there are various options here and just some of the examples from my collection. Move on now to talk briefly about paperbacks. So I'm not going to bore you to death with stacks of paperbacks. We have two examples here, one fiction, one non-fiction. Obviously there are a huge number of these to go at, lots of sort of boy's own adventure style, paperbacks of older literature as well in terms of fiction. We have here quite a contemporaneous thing, Bridge on the River Kwai, at least in terms of the film adaptation, which this book has then been published, or this version of the book has been published after. Obviously we've got the actors on the front cover here. And you can see it's in rather nice condition, still has the price tag on the front here, 6 shillings or 60 cents. So I'm very pleased to have this, quite a nice copy, and this would be ideal for including in small kit, this sort of paperback. And that's just one example. Obviously, a huge number of these to go at, and they're readily available and cheap to pick up, depending on the exact publication, but you can find cheap period paperbacks, no problem at all. The other one we have here, of course, is non-fiction, Ho Chi Minh, a political biography by Jean Lecoutre, and that's again terrible pronunciation, but my French never was very good. This was originally published in French in '67 and then was published in English. The translation was published in late '68, September '68. And this actually shows up in some footage with Max Hastings in Vietnam in '69, with the 23rd Marechal Division, and one of the grunts serving there has one of these with him, and you can see it laid out on his poncho when they're at their sort of base camp, not at a fire base, but their base camp whilst patrolling. and I thought it was quite interesting from that point of view that the soldier in Vietnam was carrying this and reading it, and I've therefore wanted to pick up a copy. And it took me a little bit of time to find an example in the paperback with this cover. It was published with a different cover, but this was the cover I saw at the time, and it's quite an interesting read. I've started on it, I've not finished it yet, but a nice thing to have. So this is another example of the sort of thing you can pick up, and it's always worth looking through period photographs, period footage, to try and see, maybe pick an example of a paperback that was actually being read at the time by a specific soldier, which is what I've done with this. So just 2 examples of paperbacks there to finish this off, and hopefully it's been interesting looking through these bits and pieces. As I say, these are the things that I use to add something to my displays of Vietnam War kit. So I do hope you found it interesting looking at this. As I say, this is part 1 of a series, and probably in part 2 we'll be looking at small electronics, so radios and that sort of thing. That's what I'm intending anyway, so hopefully that will be of interest as well. And as I say, that will be coming up in the not too distant future, all being well and time permitting. If you have found this video interesting and you'd like to see future uploads on the channel, please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. And if you are subscribing, please make sure you hit the little bell, the notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. But that's everything for this video. So until next time, bye for now.